All right, I will. If you want to send in a tithe or a gift, it's P.O. Box 230, Taos, New Mexico 87571. We're about to hear from Anandi, Geroy. She's going to speak to us on Brahma, her grandfather. She's been doing a series of Hindu deities, and it's been helping me understand the whole Hindu thing. There's so many of them. Anandi will be familiar to you by now because she lived in India for 7 years studying dance and percussion and language and culture and religion. She's taught theater and dance in India and San Francisco and Taos, and has adapted a number of folk tales from across the world for the stage. She enjoys working with children, teaching dance, theater, and folk arts. She has beautiful cows and she milks them. And that's why the chai at the temple is so wonderful, because of her and her awesome cows. And she teaches at Tisa, where my grandson goes, and they have lots of fun doing plays and dancing. So please welcome Anandi. So glad you're here, Anandi. You have to click on that mic. It has a little. There you go. You want to point it more closer? Closer. There we go. Yeah. So, you can hear me? Maybe sit a little closer to it.
Great. Thank you all for having me. I love coming to Unity. It's so wonderful to see everybody. And so last year we talked about goddesses for a few sessions, and Ganesha and different animals, Hanuman. And then we talked about a little bit about some of the avatars of Vishnu, who's one of the gods of what they call the Hindu Trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. But we never really got to the beginning. So we're going to get to the beginning now and talk about Brahma. And of the three deities who are considered the Trinity in Hinduism, Brahma is the creator god. He's called the grandfather, and he's often depicted in that way. So if you see pictures of Brahma, he looks like an elder gentleman with a long white beard and kind of evokes images of monotheistic gods of creation. But he has 4 heads, so that's a little different.
You gotta love Hinduism for that. They just really rock that stuff.
Keep it 2 random for more. 4 heads. Keep it cosmic. Keep it symbolic. So the 4 heads actually represent the 4 directions, the 4 varnas, or the castes in human society that Hinduism embraces. They also represent the 4 Vedas. So the Vedas are the sacred books of Hinduism, and there are 4 books within the Vedas. So that's the symbolism there. He's got 4 arms as well, and those also represent those 4 things. In his different arms, he holds a variety of things depending on the depiction. Sometimes he holds what's called a mala, which is like a Hindu rosary of the sacred beads. That represents the passage of time. He holds a water pot, which is what ascetics or wandering monks throughout India, that's one of the things that they carry, one of their sacred objects that they carry, and it has sacred water. So sometimes you might use it to take water from one of the sacred rivers, like the Ganga, use it for your rituals. So this little water pot, the Kamandala, and that represents the causal ocean, the causal waters from which everything emerges. We'll get into some stories about that. But he carries the sacred water pot and then various ritual items. And so those represent the sacrifice that is ongoing in this created world. So the way in which various animals and creatures of creation sacrifice for one another to perpetuate the continuity of life. So those in the Vedas, that's literally sacrificial rituals, things that are offered to a fire as sacrifices, but that symbolizes the greater sort of cycle of sacrifice that is part of this world. So that's what he holds in his hands. So a little bit about Brahma's history. He's mentioned in the Vedas, but not so much in the early Vedas. There are two other beings who are mentioned as creators. That's Purusha, which is the male principle. In Shakta philosophy, that is the male principle is Purusha, and the female principle is Prakriti. Prakriti means nature or the created world, and Purusha is the essence that pervades that. So the male essence is seen as an inert, pervading, formless essence, and the female is that which brings that essence into form. So that's Purusha and Prakriti. So Purusha is seen as the creator in the early Vedas instead of Brahma. But as time goes on, those attributes are attributed to Brahma. And then Prajapati, who's like the progenitor of human beings in Hindu philosophy, is also seen as a creator. And then later on, Brahma takes on those attributes as well.
So he kind of has his most prominence in like the later Vedic period up through the Upanishads, and kind of declines again in the time of the Puranas. And the Puranas, as I've mentioned before, Purana means old. So those are the old stories, basically the myths of Hinduism that when we hear about the mythological stories, those are the Puranas, basically. So, so Brahma not
really worshipped so much in Hinduism in the modern era, or really for a long time. And so there's various actually stories about why he lost his fame, or why he's not worshipped as much as the other two gods of the Trinity. That's Vishnu and Shiva. So Vishnu is the one who preserves life. Shiva is the destroyer. But it's basically, creation is seen as cyclical. So those causal waters that we talked about, those are the waters that everything returns to at the end of an eon. And then life begins again from those waters. And then the time of Pralaya, which is destruction, which is the time that Shiva rolls over, everything returns to those primordial waters until creation begins again. So Narayana, which is the name for Vishnu, is the form where he lays upon the causal waters, sitting on a snake called Sheshanath, which is the endless serpent, and that represents the endlessness of creation, the nature of existence. Before Vishnu had that name, Narayana, it was actually a name for Brahma as well. So there's a little bit of competition between the three about who is the top dude, top god. But generally, it's between Vishnu and Shiva, because they have large followings, and so kind of there's different texts and stories that sort of attribute prominence to either one of those two. And Brahma is there, but he's not so much in the fray. So one of the stories about why Brahma is not as important as the others is actually involves the three of them. So one day, Vishnu and Brahma were walking along a path and met each other in the middle, and they had to decide who would stand aside for the other. So they kind of got into this battle of the egos about who was the greater god. Well, I'm the creator, I created everything, I created you, so really, like, you should stand aside. I'm the grandfather, I'm the oldest, let me pass. And Vishnu says, well, actually, and there's another story about this. You actually came from my navel. You came from my belly button. So actually, I'm more primal. So you should stand aside. So they kind of get into this argument. And finally, this huge pillar of fire appears between them or next to them. That reaches so high that they can't see the top, and so low that they can't see the bottom. And this booming voice comes and says, whoever of you is able to find the end of this pillar will be deemed the top god. And so Vishnu says, okay, I'm going to turn myself into a boar, because one of his avatars or incarnations is the boar incarnation, which
is famous for digging deep into the earth. So he says, I'm going to take on my boar incarnation and I'm going to dig into the earth and find the bottom of this pillar. And Brahma says, well, great, I'm going to take on the form of the swan. And the swan is actually Brahma's vehicle, his vahana. All the gods have various vehicles that they ride around on, or sort of animals that they're associated with. And he's associated with the swan, which represents discernment. So the swan, as I think I've mentioned as well, when we were talking about Saraswati, who's actually Brahma's consort, or one of the goddesses who's associated with Brahma. She's the goddess of speech, of knowledge and wisdom. So it makes sense that she would be associated with Brahma, who's the god who is responsible for the sacred knowledge and wisdom of the Vedas, the sacred ancient texts. And so the form of that knowledge is Brahma, and their essence is Saraswati. So those two are linked. They're both associated with the swan, and the swan is supposed to be mythologically the only creature that can separate, or maybe this is true about swans, I don't know, that can separate milk from water if they are mixed. And so that symbolizes our capacity for discernment, our ability to separate the real from the unreal, even when in this world often it's hard to discern what's real, what's unreal, what's important, what's not important. That faculty of what's called vivek, or discernment, is held by the swan. And so that's the symbolism there. So he says, I'm going to turn myself into a swan and I'm going to fly up, and I will definitely find the top of this pillar. So they both go in their directions, and they go for a long time. This is a really, really big pillar. And the boar goes and finally says, like, I'm just going to give up. I can admit defeat, and I can know when I've tried my best and it's time to stop. I'm not going to find the bottom of this pillar. So Vishnu goes back and he waits. Well, meantime, Brahma is going along, and he's going up and up and up, and he's getting pretty tired too. But he is one interesting way that I've heard Brahma spoken about is as the first is ahamkar. Ahamkar means the ego. So that which so when we're all part of that primordial soup that is the uncreated essence of all things, as we differentiate, that idea of ahamkar or ego is the first sort of piece of that differentiation. So not to say that ego is bad. Ego can become too prominent in our being and lead us on a wrong path, but that sense of individuation is just a part of this reality. So that ahamkar, that ego, is also, I've heard Brahma described in that way, that he is that which takes the uncreated and makes it created by viewing things with a sense of individuated self. And so in this instance, there's a little bit too much of that ahamkar in his actions here as the swan, because he thinks, I want to be the one, I want to win, I want to be the best. So he's going and he's going in. So he sees this flower start to kind of drift down through the sky. It's the ketaki flower, also called the malika flower, this beautiful white flower with the yellow on it. And he gets this idea. He says, oh, flower, could you help me out for a minute here? And the flower says, sure, grandfather, what can I do? And Brahma says, well, I'm going to go back and I'm going to say that I reached the top of this pillar and that I found you there. So you just have to corroborate my story, okay? Just tell them, yeah, I was sitting up on the top and Brahma came and plucked me off, and here's proof that he got to the top of the pillar. So the flower's like, I don't really like to lie, but okay. Brahma takes the flower back and meets Vishnu there on the path. Vishnu says, I couldn't find the bottom. I admit defeat. Did you find the top? And Brahma says, yes, I did. Vishnu's like, really? Are you sure? Because it seemed like a pretty big pillar. But Brahma says, look, I've got this ketaki flower, and that's my proof. It was sitting there on the top. Wasn't it, ketaki flower? And the flower says, yeah, I was up there. Sure, Brahma plucked me from the top. Well, of course, the disembodied voice comes back again and says, Brahma, you're lying. This is the voice of Shiva. And we're going to get into Shiva next time, because it's actually Shiva's big holiday next month in February. So for Shivratri, we'll be talking about Shiva. But
Do you know what day that is?
It is Saturday, the 18th, I believe. So this is actually a Shiva linga, which is represents a lot of things, but in this sense, it's a huge pillar of fire, and it's endless. And this actually represents the endlessness of Shiva. Of course, this, I think, story comes from the Shiva Purana. So this is one of the stories that says, actually, Shiva's greater than the other two. In the Vishnu Purana, you'll get ones that say Vishnu's greater. So, so this story comes from the Shiva Purana. And because Brahma lied, Shiva curses him that he's never going to have a lot of worshipers. He's never going to have a lot of followers, and he won't have a lot of temples. And he also curses that poor flower, the Ketaki, that it can never be used in the worship of Shiva. So you'll see on Shivalingams, they're like sort of a phallic symbol that a lot of them come from the Narmada River, and they are kind of shaped. Anyway, maybe I'll bring some pictures of them, talk about Shivratri and Shiva, but a lot of times you offer flowers onto the Shiva Lingam as part of the worship. But the Ketaki flower or the Malika, you're not supposed to offer because it lied. It said it was on top of the Shiva Lingam when it wasn't. So that is one mythological story about why Brahma doesn't have a lot of temples. He's actually only got one famous temple in all of India, which is so much less than Shiva and Vishnu have. They've got temples on every corner. Often Brahma is maybe like a minor deity in a Shiva or Vishnu temple, because we look at like the sacred text about temple architecture and who's supposed to be where. Brahma is one of the gods that's supposed to be kind of caretaker gods for the various directions or parts of the temple, and to guard the main deity. So sometimes he'll be there, but as far as his own temple, the main one is in Pushkar. It's in Rajasthan, which is a place I visited when I lived in India, and it's beautiful. If anyone's been to Rajasthan, it's this beautiful deserty area. There's a big lake there in Pushkar, a sacred lake, and there is the Brahma temple. But that's the only one. So I'll give you another story for why perhaps Brahma has less temples. So this is a creation story too. So back at the beginning of, we'll talk about a few Brahma creation stories. So one of the creation stories is actually about something called the Hiranyagarbha, and that is the golden egg or the golden womb, the golden embryo. So in this kind of cosmology story, and the world, of course, is all just the causal waters. So it's all just the ancient ocean. And on this ocean, there is this golden egg floating. And from the golden egg, Brahma is inside the golden egg. And he lives there for thousands and thousands of years. And eventually, when he emerges from the golden egg, he brings with him all created things. And so that is one of the creation stories from Hinduism, about how it all begins from this golden egg. Another story is that Brahma he split himself in two and made part of himself a female so that creation could continue. But in this story, Brahma actually, he falls in love, or lust really, with this female that he's created. And so she is the first female. Because she comes from him, she's his daughter. She's also his wife. She's also his sister. So a complex relationship. And the feeling that he has that he wants to mate with her is so strong that he wants to see her all the time. She's so beautiful. He becomes totally enamored with her and basically loses his senses to this sense of infatuation with this female being. And this is one of the stories that talks about why he has the 4 heads. He starts to grow heads on all sides so that he actually can always have her in his sight. And he wants to see her all the time, but she's modest and she doesn't want to always be in the male gaze. And so eventually she becomes, she doesn't know where to hide. She feels like she doesn't have any place that's her own. And so she turns herself into a cow and shoots up into the sky and flies away as this cosmic cow. And Brahma, even then, he won't let her go. He actually sprouts a 5th head that's looking up so that he can look at her in the sky too, even as she is there as the cosmic cow. And Shiva, again, another story about Shiva's dominance here. He finally says, Brahma, what are you doing? Like, this lust that you're experiencing that's overwhelming your senses, which can also be translated on a more philosophical level into a preoccupation with the created world rather than the essence of things. So his preoccupation with the form that he created, the beauty and loveliness of the form, completely took him away from a meditation and union with the essence of all things. And so because of that sort of transgression of his, Shiva cuts off that fifth head of his. So that's why, also even in the story of the lingam of fire, in some versions, Brahma actually has 5 heads, and one of the heads is cut off in that story too. And then he's also cursed to have less temples and no worshippers. So poor Brahma, he kind of gets cursed here and there at the beginning of his creation. So that is another story about creation and Brahma. He also created theater. So if you read the Natya Shastra, and that's something interesting to me because that's my background, and I studied Indian dance for a long time. And ancient Sanskrit theater and dance are both considered to be the same art. So in the earliest theatrical forms, many things were enacted in a very physical way, involving music and dance and spoken word, sort of all in one. That all comes from a text called the Natya Shastra, and that is called the 5th Veda. So the various forms, attributes of theater come from the 4 Vedas, and Brahma is the one who's said to have brought those all together and created the theatrical form at the request of Indra, who's the god of heaven, to entertain everybody. And then it was brought down to humans through the sage named Bharata. And Shiva and Parvati, who are the first dancers. Shiva is Nataraj, who's the lord of dance, and his wife Parvati is also a beautiful dancer. And as Shiva as Nataraj, he does what's called a Tandava dance, which is this very vigorous dance, which is the dance which brings the destruction of the universe. Like he dances so hard that the whole thing starts to break up, and we have the pralaya. And then Parvati, in some stories, she calms him down. She does what's called lasya, which is the beautiful, very lyrical, feminine form of dance. And so those two together, if you see Indian classical dance, they always incorporate both elements. Like there's a lot of foot stomping, and that comes from Tandava, a lot of like vigorous sort of acrobatics and jumping. And then there's also a lot of like lyrical grace, and that comes from Lasya. I'm sure we'll have more than one day to talk about Shiva, so we'll put a little bit of him in here today. So those are 2 stories about why Brahma has less followers. Now there's an interesting point about his name, Brahma. So there is Brahma, who's this grandfather god, who's the creator. There's Brahman or Param Brahma, which is the Hindu idea of that beyond all of these hundreds and thousands of gods and goddesses, there is an indwelling essence that is the spiritual essence of all things, and that is called Brahman. So this name Brahma comes from that idea of Brahman, and then there's also Brahmin with an I. I mean, we say it with an I, but and those are the priestly caste or the priests in India. So those 3 are related, and the priests are the ones who are supposed to be disseminating the knowledge of the Vedas. So it's all related to knowledge and wisdom as being a primal essence of creation and of all things. So that's a little bit on his name. Let's see if I have anything else here. Brahma, like I said, of the 3 gods in the Hindu Trinity, as far as stories and things about Brahma, there's not as much. There's a lot more about Shiva and Vishnu. Actually, some of Vishnu's incarnations, the boar, like I mentioned, Varaha, also Matsya, the fish, and the Kurma, the turtle, those were initially attributes of Brahma, names for Brahma, before they got sort of incorporated into Vishnu. So if we lived thousands of years ago, we may have more prominence for Brahma or more stories about Brahma, just more things that are attributed to him.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Because Saraswati is also musical,
Yeah.
is he connected with music at all?
Well, he's connected with all of the arts and crafts. So music being part of that. Yeah, like the arts and sciences sort of thing is contained within that idea of the Vedas or wisdom. So both sacred and secular arts and sciences are his domain. Another thing actually that I want to mention is about the three gunas. We talked a little bit about that previously too, but there's Sattva guna, which is the essence of sort of purity and light. There's Rajaguna, which is the movement, essence of creation. And then there's Tamaguna, which is which is like heavy and dark. And those three things aren't seen as good or bad in Hinduism. They're just part of reality. So like all of us contain all of those, and the microphone contains all of those. Everything contains some portion of those different gunas, and they're kind of the building blocks of reality, from a very subtle energetic level up into a gross physical level. When you look at Ayurveda, the science of health and healing in Hinduism, in India, there's a lot, we talk about the gunas in there too, and balancing the gunas with food by like what you take into your being and how that affects your psychology and all of that too, your mental state, how the food that you take in affects you on all the levels from gross to subtle. So those gunas are also associated with the various gods. And so Brahma is actually associated with the Rajaguna. So that's because that's a creative force. It's a force of movement that goes in between the other two forces of tamas and sattva. Vishnu is the sattva guna. He is also associated mythologically with the gods or the devas. That word in Sanskrit, div or dev, that root means light. And so the sattva guna is associated with those beings who are light beings. And Shiva is associated with the tamaguna because of he brings about destruction or pralaya, which is like the death energy. So that's like a more like a tamasic, heavier, because death, also in this world, like putrefaction. If you look at like foods in Ayurveda, they talk about even like fermented foods as having a lot of the tamaguna in them, even though they're healthy for our digestion and all of that. They have that energy of like something that's decomposing in it. So that's how the three gunas also kind of fit in with these three gods. And so you can see also in some of those stories about his egoic nature, or a little bit about like his lustful nature, that creation, at least in the creation in the way that it happens in this world, can't really continue without those energies, without a sense of I am an individual and lust, because that is clearly how humans are created. Without that energy, we wouldn't have human or animal creation. So that energy of the Rajaguna, which is like a heating energy, is it can be associated with restlessness, passion, ambition, or activity. And so those things are also necessary for creation. And I find it interesting that in the Hindu world, there's not so much of a sense of like badness or sin associated with various energies, that they're all needed and a part of this cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction. It's just figuring out where their place is, where the right place is, what prominence they should have, and how they can all fit together to keep things in harmonious. And so I think that is an interesting facet of Hindu philosophy. Does anyone else have questions? I have a couple, I believe, some minutes for questions. Yeah.
My son has a close friend named Shiv from India. So can you?
Yeah, Shiva, that's so the end. So Shiv and Shiva are basically the same word, all consonants in Devanagari, which is the written language of Sanskrit and Hindi. They have a vowel associated with them. So the vowel that goes with every consonant, unless you change the vowel by putting a different sign, is an a short a. So Shiva and Shiv are the same. Yeah. So that's the god of destruction. Yeah. He's a very powerful god. You'll be happy to know that. Yeah. Yeah, another name for Brahma is Swayambhu, which means self-born, and a lot of the primary sages in the ancient Hindu texts were all born from his mind. So,
so is he the one who said Om? Because
right, the sound
how everything was
of
created.
creation.
Yeah.
I haven't read anything about that.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm not sure.
okay.
Yeah. But I think
Because he's the creator.
yeah, and the
obviously.
primal sound and Saraswati being associated with him too, and Vach was the more ancient Vedic god of speech, who Saraswati took on some of her attributes as time went on, and Saraswati went to prominence. And a lot of the early Vedic gods are not the main gods that are and goddesses that are worshipped now in India. Some of them retained their kind of place in the hierarchy, but a lot of those early Vedic gods, which were more nature gods, are less prominent now. But yeah, that makes sense to me, but I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
Does he have a day? Does he have a time of year? Or I would think spring when things are.
No, not really. Like he doesn't have a lot of that stuff that the other gods
Yeah,
have.
because Shiva has.
Shiva has.
February is
Yeah.
his thing, and
I mean, I can get
Shiva-
into a little because honestly, I think next time there's so much to say about Shiva. I can talk a little about Shiva now before I get into that. So Shiva Mahashivratri is what's coming up in February, and actually every month has a Shivratri. This is just the biggest one. And Shivratri is the new moon day of every month.
Which is today.
Which
Today
is
the new
today, yeah. So it's a month from now, Mahashivratri. And astrologically, I will find out before next time that I talk why Mahashivratri is different than the other Shivratris, probably like the closeness of the moon to the earth on that day or something, but I'll find out. But yeah, it's the new moon, and Shiva actually wears the crescent moon in his top knot. That's one of his attributes. So he's interesting. He's the god of destruction, but he also, creation and destruction are so married in Hindu philosophy because time is cyclical that you can't like recreate, start a new. Oh, I just remembered another story about Brahma. I'll tell you guys about the yugas and the cycles of creation, but you can't recreate without destroying. So Shiva really, he really holds both of those things. And as Nataraja, he has in his hands, he holds fire, and fire symbolizes creation. Like I was talking about the Rajaguna, that fiery creative force. And then he also holds the Damaru, which is the drum. And it's this drumbeat of time, which symbolizes destruction, because time is the great destroyer, that which like ends things in this world. So he really holds both. He is that kind of that place in between where things end and they begin. It's like, it's hard to know really where one ends, where the next begins. He's that transitional zone. And so as that, he's very cosmic and mystical and super fun. So one other story about Brahma is actually happened between the Kritya Yuga and the Treta Yuga, which are yugas are eons or cycles of creation. When one ends, so there's all of these layers of time in Hindu cosmology. At the end of all of the yugas, a full cycle of all creation is supposed to end. You have a huge pralaya, everything goes back to that cosmic ocean, where Vishnu is laying on the serpent and creation happens again. Two more stories to tell you about Brahma. Okay, one is in between the Kritya and Treta yugas. So humanity over time, as each of these yugas progresses, is supposed to become sort of less pure, less moral, less cosmic. Are you agreeing? As we go on, we're now in the Kali Yuga, which is supposed to be the final one, where we're kind of like way off base. And at the end of this will be the final pralaya, and then it'll all start again.
But way back at the beginning, between those two yugas, humanity in the Kritya Yuga was supposed to have been moral without needing to be prompted. So they were just naturally moral. They didn't need anyone telling them you should be like this or not like this. As that yuga began to, and also they didn't need to farm. It's kind of like the Garden of Eden. They didn't need to farm. They didn't need to hunt. They were just fed by the universe. So as they sort of degraded in their spiritual essence, they became more egoic, they started to fight, they started to separate themselves, feel less unity, they started to fight for resources. It said the earth withdrew her bounty. So they weren't able to be just fed by the essence of the earth. They became hungry, and then they started to fight more about for sustenance, and they went to Brahma for help. Often, actually, in the Puranas, people go to Brahma for help, and he'll grant various boons and do different things to help them. A lot of times, he helps demons because he's like, not because they're demons, but because they're really into doing hardcore asceticism. That's their nature. That's their way of practicing spirituality, is to, like, in a kind of a demonic way. So after hundreds and thousands and millions of years of asceticism, they'll get the attention of Brahma asking for a boon, and a lot of times he'll give them a boon, which then Vishnu is associated with the gods. He's over there with the gods, like helping them win this eternal battle with the demons that's always going on for good and evil in the world. That one of the demons will get really powerful from a boon from Brahma, and then the gods will have to get really creative about how to overcome him, with, even though he's got this boon that says, oh, I can't be killed by this or this or this or this or this. They'll have to kind of get creative. So Brahma has that function in mythology as well. But in the end of this age, the humans go and they ask Brahma, we're hungry, we don't know how to gain food. And often the sacred cow, Kamadhenu, is also associated with the earth. And we talked about the cow a few months ago. But so the earth is sometimes personified, or I'm not sure what the word is for personification as an animal, but as a cow. And so Brahma actually milks the earth as a cow. And from her comes all the grains and the fruits and all the bounty of the earth. And that's given to humans so that they have a way to sustain themselves. And that's another story about Brahma and creation and the cow. And then, the other one I thought of was about, he's called, sometimes Brahma's called Padmaja. Padma means lotus, and Ja is the Sanskrit root for birth. So he's the lotus born is another name for him. And that's because he's often pictured sitting on the lotus that comes out of Vishnu's navel. Again, this is Vishnu taking prominence as the main god because of his followers. You know, there's stories created so that each god can have prominence for their group. So in the vision where Narayana or Vishnu is the main god, he's laying on the cosmic ocean, and creation happens when a lotus comes from his navel, and on that lotus sits Brahma looking in the four directions, and then the Vedas are created and things come, but ultimately from Vishnu. So in this story, there's that cosmic ocean, and Vishnu's lying there, and Brahma strolls up and says, hey, who are you? And Vishnu says, well, I am the uncreated being. I create all. Everything's contained within me. I'm the creator and destroyer of all things. And Brahma says, oh, wait a minute. So am I. I'm also the all creator, and everything resides within me. I'm beyond form. And so they decide to check it out and see, like, is this really true? So Brahma dives into Vishnu. First, Vishnu dives into Brahma's being to check out the verity of his story. And he dives into his cosmic self, and he wanders around, and he sees the entire universe within him. And he says, comes out and says, yeah, you're right. And so Brahma says, okay, I'm going to go check it out too. So he goes into Vishnu's cosmic being, and the universe there is so vast, he actually gets lost, can't find his way out, and has to escape through his belly button. So there's one of the stories.
Wow.
Why Brahma is the lotus coming out of Vishnu's navel. So, yeah. I think that's all I got.
That's very cool. Thank you for enlightening us, Anandi. I'm trying to think about songs about lotuses and navels, all kinds of things, and I can't think of anything. So, because it is a New Year day and a new moon day, I'm just going to sing my happy song because I'm pretty happy that the sun is shining today. I'm feeling happy, it's a happy day. The sun is shining, it's a happy day. The birds are singing, it's a happy day. I'm calm and centered on this happy day. Even when things don't go my way, disappointment on your holiday. No matter what the news has to say, feeling happy, it's a happy day. Could die tomorrow, still a happy day. Feel your sorrow, it's a happy day. This life is borrowed on this happy day. Even when things don't go our way, loss and strife every day. No matter what the news has to say, because there are peaches and because there's pie, because there's blue up in the sky. I don't know how and I do not know why, but there is love anyway. We're feeling happy on a happy day. The sun is shining on this happy day. The birds are singing on a happy day. I'm calm and centered on this hippity happy day. Hope you all have a happy day and you are more enlightened about Brahma. I am, thank you. It's always good to know. Hinduism is such a trip because it's so human. It just has all of the human qualities and it doesn't really have a judgment about it. It's just like, yeah, we're egotistical. Yeah, we do this. Yeah, we trip and lose our way. So that's why I love it. Thank you, Money. Next week, we have Valerie talking about the ley lines around here and around the whole planet, and that'll be really interesting. And thank you for all being here. Love you all. We're going to sing our love song. Thank you. And now we have it so it's not going to be backwards. So y'all can see, yeah. Ooh, except we lost our. No, it's just a chord. Okay, she's gonna get it. She's gonna get it. There you go. You got it. Yep. Is it there? Is it there? Did something else happen? Oh well, most people know it, so we'll just sing. Now there is love on earth, and it has begun with me. Now there is love on earth, the love that was meant to be. With all our relations, loved ones all are we. Now I walk with my family in perfect harmony. Love has begun with me, and this is the moment now. With every breath I take, let this be my joyous vow. To take each moment and live each moment in love eternally. Now there is love on earth, and it has begun with me. We are the light, the love, and the presence. Wherever we are, love is, and all is well. Thank you, everybody.
And if you'd like to sign up for our newsletter, there's a clipboard in the back, or, you know, if you didn't get all your prayers out and you need to be, there's someone that needs to be prayed for, there's slips on the back and you can drop them in the box. And
Katie prays for him, and she's really good. You need a little extra. Love you guys. Mwah. All right.